Okay, so we are back here for lecture 2, and this lecture will be on environmental science and sustainability. Again, I went ahead and did not include the picture of myself in this, so that way then you can actually get the whole entire screen. These slides are just a little more busy, so I thought that it would make things a little bit easier. So for our objectives for this lecture, the first one is going to be to differentiate between ecology, environmental science, and environmentalism. And the second one is going to be to define sustainability and describe the components of sustainability. I'm going to give examples of renewable, non-renewable, and perpetual resources. I'm going to define the two components of natural capital, give examples of environmental externalities and also trade-offs. And then I'm going to explain the concept of the ecological footprint and what we use it for. And then lastly, I'm going to describe the relationships between poverty, wealth, and sustainability and talk about how they're interrelated. So first up, I want to start off by defining ecology and then defining environmentalism and talking about the differences between the two of them. So when we talk about the environment is everything around you, and it's going to include things like energy from the sun or your solar energy and all of the living things that are around you, plants, animals, bacteria, as well as all of the non-living things such as air, water, and sunlight with which you interact. So when we talk about ecology is the biological science that is going to study those relationships, the relationships between living things and all of those things and their environment. Again, including the non-living components like solar energy and air and water and sunlight, along with all of the living things that you interact with, plants, animals, and bacteria. Okay, so that's what ecology is going to, and we actually call those the non-living components, the abiotic factors, because abiotic means a without, bio life. So all of those non-living components as well as the biotic factors, the living factors. And then environmentalism is actually the social movement dedicated to protecting the environment. So when we talk about environmentalism, this is kind of based on environmental activism, which is more of a social movement to protect the Earth's life support system for humans as well as other species. And so environmentalism is really more environmental activism. And so despite humans' many scientific and technological advances, our lives depend on that sunlight and the earth for clean air, water, food, shelter, energy, all of those things that are in our environment, right? And environmentalism is really more of the social movement dedicated to protecting those. Okay, so then lastly, we have this definition of environmental science. And environmental science is the study of the connections in the natural environment. It studies interactions among all components of the environment, including humans, and how to solve those environmental problems. So when we look at environmental science is more of an interdisciplinary study. It's going to take into account ecology, okay? But it's also going to take into account all of these other components, including the human factor, on how to solve some of these environmental problems. So not only does environmental science include ecology in it, but it also includes politics and economics and ethics in there. So again, environmental science is really more of an interdisciplinary study. It's an interdisciplinary study of how the earth and nature works and how it's survived and thrived, how humans interact with that environment, and 3, how humans can live more sustainably. Environmental science strives to answer questions like, what environmental problems do we face? How serious are they? How do they interact? What are their causes? How has nature solved such problems, and how can we solve such problems? So again, environmental science is this interdisciplinary science that includes not just science, but also politics, economics, and ethics. And we're going to kind of talk about how that is. So lastly, when we use this word sustainability is kind of including this, what we call the human factor. So if we look again, the Earth is actually about 4.65 billion years old. And life on Earth really began I shouldn't say just about, but 3.8 billion years ago. And that was prokaryotic life, the bacterial life. But when you look at humans, and if you looked at the formation of the Earth, from the formation of the Earth until now, and we put this on a time scale that's more tangible to us, so we could project Earth's history in a 24-hour day. Humans have only been around for literally these less than a minute, last 20 seconds. So again, we've been around for such a short time frame. However, we've had a really large impact on the Earth. So again, humans have been around for about 200,000 years, less than the blink of an eye when compared to the age of the entire Earth at 4.65 billion years old. But again, during our short time on Earth, humans have expanded into and dominated almost all of Earth's ecosystems. And over all of the species, our species, single species, is the species to have the largest impact on Earth's ecosystems. So the growing impact of humans threatens the existence of many species and adds pollutants to the Earth's air, water, and soil that are impacting, again, all of Earth's ecosystems. And so when we talk about sustainability, we are talking about including this human factor. So sustainability, when we define sustainability is this idea that development can meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So again, the sustainability idea is this idea that we can come up with these ideas of development that would, again, not compromise the ability of future generations, including other species, to meet their own needs. So when we look at this idea of sustainability, there are these three natural factors that we have to consider that play these very key roles in the long-term stability of the planet's life. And so when we look at these three natural factors, and we talk about later on some of these pillars of sustainability for businesses and development, we have to look at how, again, those pillars will impact these three natural factors that are key. They play these very key roles in stability, the sustainability and long-term stability of the planet. So these three major natural factors are going to be: 1, solar energy; 2, chemical cycling; and 3, biodiversity. It's pretty easy to see, obviously, how solar energy plays into this factor of sustainability, because, again, solar energy is responsible for providing the right temperature for basically life on Earth, right? It's not too hot, it's not too cold, it provides the right climate. Again, that solar energy is very important for productivity, such as primary productivity and our photosynthetic organisms. So it's easy to see how solar energy plays a very key role in the sustainability and stability of this planet. Now, the second one is chemical cycling. And chemical cycling actually includes what we call nutrients, right? We call many of these chemicals that are important for plant and animal life and are needed for plant and animal life to survive. We call them nutrients. And the earth receives no new supplies of these life-supporting chemicals here that are involved with chemical cycling. Now, through billions of years of interactions with their both living and non-living environment, organisms have developed these ways to recycle these chemicals that are needed for survival. Wastes and decayed bodies of organisms, right, become the nutrients and raw materials for other organisms, especially these decomposing organisms. Things like fungus are really important for this. And so in nature, waste actually equals useful resources. Now, obviously, humans are changing the way this chemical cycling happens, especially with these very important chemicals like carbon. So carbon is an important chemical for chemical cycling. Nitrogen is an important chemical for chemical cycling. And so obviously humans are now impacting and changing that chemical cycling pathway. The last one is biodiversity. Biodiversity simply, it literally means the diversity of life. Bio means life, right? So this is the diversity of life. And biodiversity includes these interactions among all these species that provide very vital ecosystem services and keep any population from growing too large, right? Having that biodiversity, this diversity of life helps to keep organisms in check. Biodiversity also provides ways for species to adapt to changing environmental conditions and for new species to arise, right, as conditions change and replace those that might be wiped out by certain catastrophic events, catastrophic environmental changes. So that biodiversity is very important. It plays a key role in this long-term stability of the earth. So again, these are these three major principles. Sorry, I should have skipped this slide for you. So again, solar energy, the sun's energy warms the planet. It provides energy plants can use to produce nutrients. This is kind of all of the stuff I said, but actually written out for you here. Chemical nutrient cycling, the circulation of nutrients from the environment, mostly from the soil and water through various organisms and back to the environment is very, again, important to the stability of our planet. And lastly, that biodiversity, the variety of genes. Species are very important for ecosystem processes. And so again, maintaining that biodiversity is important for the stability of the planet. So again, those are kind of the three major natural, kind of what we call the natural factors that play this important key role in sustainability. So now we're going to talk about sustainable development really briefly, and then I'm going to actually let a video kind of talk to you a little bit more about these pillars and how they're interrelated for sustainability. But when we talk about this term sustainable development is how we can do development today. And this is more associated with business and business development and more in terms of human development. And this development needs to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, right? And then we talked about that as being kind of the definition for sustainability. And for businesses today to meet this kind of goal of sustainability, they must balance these three pillars of sustainability. they have to consider not just the environmental factors and these natural factors that we talked about, but they also have to consider economic and social factors that are very important, again, as we talked about in environmental science. So these social factors such as how will this development impact multiple groups of people? Will it impact one group positively but one negatively? Is it equitable? Is it sustainable for a long period of time? And then also these economic factors, okay? How will this development impact the economy? Is it positive in the short term, but it's not really sustainable, meaning that these companies might make a lot of money in the short term, but then eventually as they deplete resources, then they're going to bust and crash. Some of our fisheries are experiencing that right now. So again, these are the three factors that are most important in terms of considering development today. And please watch this 10-minute video. It was a really great 10-minute video on, if I had you in lecture, I would actually play this video because it does such a great job of explaining these three pillars of sustainability. So make sure you watch that. Now, the UN also has these sustainable development goals as well. They have these 17 sustainable development goals, and you don't need to memorize these by any means, but I just wanted to show you that the UN does have these goals. I just wanted you to recognize that there are these goals, the United Nations goals set up by the Department of Economic and Social Affairs for sustainable development. So again, as development occurs, if you are looking to be a company that's out there and your goal is sustainable development, these are 17 factors that you need to consider. So, and it's nice because this goes through each one, talks about, again, poverty. Goal number 1 is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. And again, the goal is for all. So goal number 2 is to end hunger for all, sustainable agriculture purposes, things like that. Or practices, things like that. Goal number 3 is to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Then quality education for everyone, gender equality for everyone, clean water and sanitation for all, affordable and clean energy, and so on. So again, these are developmental, if you are trying to meet this goal of sustainable development, these are developmental practices that you would want to include in your business model. And you may not be able to include all of them, but to be able to include as many as possible. So again, your business may not directly be able to provide clean water and sanitation, but maybe again, as a product of some of your profits, you are going to donate money to organizations, certain percentage of your profit to these organizations that are going out and providing clean water and sanitation for some of these rural communities that do not currently have that. So again, I just wanted to show you that site so you are aware of the fact that the UN does have these 17 sustainable development goals. But again, you're not responsible for knowing them, and I won't test you on them. And so when we talk about sustainability, there are some kind of key components or terms that you need to understand sustainability. And so one of them is this term that we call natural capital. And natural capital just is a simple, in its most simplest form, equals the natural resources and the ecosystem or natural services that support and sustain Earth's life and human economies based on those natural resources. So what this is basically it consists of all of these natural resources and the ecosystem services that they provide. So for example, we might talk about, again, in terms of natural capital, we've got things like biodiversity, life, right? That is a natural resource. And the ecosystem services that it supplies are things like population control. Again, more biodiversity we have, the more organisms we have, the better population control we have. It may also provide pest control, right? Again, the more life that we have, the better we can control populations of organisms like pests, because we have potential predators for those pests. So again, this is the resource, and then these are those ecosystem services that they provide. So again, soil is another example, again, of a natural resource, and the ecosystem service that it provides is soil renewal. So again, the soil, based on the things that are in the soil, if we maintain that soil and that soil as healthy soil, then that soil has bacteria and things like that will break down organic material and bring back nutrients to the soil. So again, these are ecosystem services that are provided by natural resources that help sustain Earth's life and human economies. So let's talk about this natural capital and these natural resources. And when we talk about these natural resources, again, these materials and or energy that's provided by nature, right? And that we find is essential or very useful to humans. These natural resources fall into three categories, and you do need to know these three categories. So the first one is called an inexhaustible or perpetual resource. And this is a resource that will never run out in terms of a human time scale. So for example, a great example of a perpetual resource is solar energy, right? Since the sun is expected to last for at least 5 billion years, we consider this a perpetual resource. It's not going to run out per se on our human time scale at this point in time, right? Okay. Now, renewable resources are resources that can be replaced through natural processes if not used up faster than nature can renew them. Okay, so some examples of renewable resources might be things like forests and grasslands, very fertile topsoil, fish populations, right? Those are examples of renewable resources. But again, they're only renewable if they're not used up faster than nature can renew it. And so when we talk about things like fisheries right now, there are certain fish species that we are not fishing sustainably. And so because of that, they are no longer a renewable resource. We are removing them faster than they can replace themselves. Okay? And so you're going to hear we're going to use this term called sustainable yield. And I do want you to know this term, sustainable yield. Sustainable yield is the highest rate at which humans can use a renewable resource indefinitely without reducing its available supply. So what that means is it's the highest rate at which we can remove some of that resource, but still maintain it as a renewable resource, right? So for example, when we talk about sustainable yields for fisheries, that is the most fish that we can remove, okay, out of the ocean at this point in time, based on the information we have, without reducing that fish species overall, without reducing the supply that would be available every year, okay? And then non-renewable or exhaustible resources are resources that cannot be replaced, okay? So non-renewable resources are resources that take millions to billions of years to form through geological processes. So this is going to be things like oil, natural gas, coal, certain metallic minerals like copper and aluminum, right? They just simply cannot be replaced in human scale time, right? And we cannot use those at a rate that's renewable. So that's a non-renewable or exhaustible resource. So let's go through some examples of this. So which of these is a perpetual resource? Again, which of these, and you probably know because I gave an example, is a resource, again, that in human time scale is not going to run out? Okay, and as you probably guessed, solar energy. Solar energy is that resource. Again, we're using certain things like cotton and coal, even our fresh water, potable water, at rates that are, again, are just not going to be they're not going to be around forever on a human time scale. So again, solar energy, sunlight, is the only perpetual resource that we can say, again, is expected to last, again, on a human time scale for at least 5 billion years. Okay, so sunlight is our only perpetual resource there. Now, which of these is considered to be a renewable resource? Is it oil? Is it trees? Is it iron? Is it wind? And so if you said trees in this example, you are correct, okay? Trees have the potential to be a renewable resource. We can use trees at a rate, right, that at which they will be replaced, okay, without hurting that overall population. We can, not necessarily that we are at this point in time, but we can use them as a renewable resource. Now, let's talk about these other examples and why they are not a renewable resource. So oil, again, we gave oil as an example of an exhaustible, right, non-renewable resource. And that's because, again, it takes millions to billions of years to form oil. And so because of that, it's not a renewable resource. Same with iron, okay? Iron, again, is a mineral that, again, takes too long to form. And so as we draw iron out and we use iron as a resource, it's not a renewable resource. Now you may say, but what about wind? Wind seems like it should be a renewable resource, right? But wind is actually a perpetual resource, right? So wind would be another great example of a perpetual resource because it's expected to last. We don't anticipate that wind is, going to all of a sudden on our atmosphere is going to change and we're not going to have, the composition of the atmosphere that we have to be able to produce wind. So at this point in time, right, wind and solar energy are these perpetual resources. We will always, on the human time scale, have these resources available to us. So wind is actually considered to be a perpetual resource. So again, trees are the only example here that meets renewable resource. Now, again, when we talk about natural capital, we're talking about not just the natural resources, right? But also about the ecosystem services that they provide. And that's a little bit more challenging to think about. So when we talk about ecosystem services are the processes that support human life and healthy ecosystems. So basically, these are the natural services that help support us and support healthy ecosystems that natural resources provide us, okay? So let me give a couple examples of this. So again, an example may be that, forests, right, actually help to purify our air. The trees help to purify the air as well as the water, right? Because again, as water moves through the soil and into these river systems, that the soil actually will help to purify that water. Also, again, forests can help reduce soil erosion. They help us regulate climate, recycle nutrients. They can provide all of these great ecosystem services for us. Thus, our lives and economies are really sustained ultimately by the energy from the sun and the natural resources that it helps maintain and the ecosystem services that those natural resources provide us. So again, that natural capital equals just not the natural resources, but the ecosystem services that those natural resources provide us. So again, water purification, waste recycling, energy supply, recreation, all of these things again are, and I didn't include recreation before, but recreation is obviously a great ecosystem service that's provided to us by some of these natural resources, especially if you like to kayak like me, I do. And we didn't really talk about waste cycling, but here is a dung beetle, and obviously there are many organisms that feed on and break down the wastes of other organisms. And so that's an important ecosystem service for us as well. So natural capital, as you probably well know, can be degraded by human activity. And we can deplete natural resources and disturb our ecosystem services with human activity. Or it can be enhanced by human activity. Okay, and I'm going to give you examples of each. So when we talk about the fact that natural capital can be degraded by human activity, we can look at things like where we are clear cutting Amazon rainforest for farmland. So we're clear cutting this biodiverse rainforest here and putting in, we take all of the plant life out, clear cut it, and then we're going to put in a monoculture of one type of agricultural plant that we want to grow, right? And so what do you think is happening to your overall biodiversity? So obviously it's going down. Not only is the biodiversity of just the plant life, because you took all of the variety of plants that were existing here and you replaced them with a monoculture of one plant, but also then all of the animals that have relied on those plants, now you're removing all of that biodiversity, right? And now you're going to have a much smaller number of species that are going to be able to survive on that one type of plant. So again, obviously, and then you're also obviously impacting other ecosystem services, like the fact that, again, you've removed a lot of biomass, a lot of plant biomass that was taking in carbon dioxide and cleaning our air. So again, we're impacting and disturbing not only this natural resource, but also the ecosystem services that it provided. Okay. And so here's some examples of natural capital degradation with, things like air pollution, climate change, soil erosion, shrinking forests. Again, these are all ways in which we have impacted our natural capital in a negative way. However, natural capital can also be enhanced by human activity. And we're not going to talk about this a lot now because I'm going to get to this later on in the semester. But I wanted to give you the, not just the doom and gloom, but also ways in which humans can actually enhance our natural capital. And so one of those ways is, and I teach marine biology, so I talk a lot about regenerative ocean farming methods. So ways in which we can take kind of a barren area of the ocean that's been highly disturbed, and we can farm it in a way that provides lots of diversity. And we can farm it in a way that we can provide lots of ecosystem services. So we might put in some kelp here, and that kelp is going to help to provide oxygen to the water and increase the percent dissolved oxygen because that kelp can do photosynthesis, right? It's a primary producer. We also may put in some bivalves like mussels and clams or scallops. And these organisms actually filter the water. They feed on some of the organic materials in the water and filter that water. So they actually provide the ecosystem service of cleaning the water. So again, by doing some of this regenerative ocean farming or restorative ocean farming, we can actually enhance our natural capital in this area. And you can see the same thing can happen with agricultural practices on land. Regenerative agriculture is going to provide a much more biodiverse area, a much healthier area that will provide more ecosystem services. And if you have not seen the Netflix documentary, Kiss the Ground, this is a great Netflix documentary to talk about regenerative agriculture. It's very interesting and honestly motivating in terms of some of the negative things that you hear about farming today. So natural capital can also be enhanced with what we call the 3 R's. So the 3 R's are, you guys know these. Come on. These are from when you were a kid, right? Reduce, reuse, recycle. So we can simply reduce the amount of resources that we're using. So a very simple idea is buy fresh jalapenos, not the jalapenos that come in the preservatives in a jar, right? We can reuse products more than once. So for example, we can use jars to store other foods besides just the jalapenos when we're done with them, okay? And then recycling our old materials into new materials. So put maybe that used jar in the recycling bin when you're done with it. So that way, then again, it can be recycled and reused to make new materials. So which of these R's do you think is the most sustainable? And so if you said reduce is obviously our first goal, okay? Our first goal is to reduce the amount of that resource that we use, because then we're not using as much of that resource, right? The second one, in terms of, again, more sustainable, is to reuse those products more than once. So if you're going to go ahead and you're going to use that product, then try to reuse it. Reuse every part of that product. So if it was jalapenos that came in a jar, try to reuse that jar. Okay. And then the third one is recycle. And we'll talk about why recycling isn't your first goal. So again, the most sustainable of these is reduce. Then reuse, recycling's at the bottom. And the reason is that when we recycle, only about, and especially when we're looking at plastics, only about 9% of the plastics out there are actually recycled. So a very small percentage, okay? Now, obviously, we want you to recycle. Recycling is a part of sustainability. And I put this for Scottsdale because it's Scottsdale Community College. So if you want to know what Scottsdale recycles, these are the things that Scottsdale recycles, and these are the things that Scottsdale does not recycle. So plastic bags are not recycled. Snack wrappers are not recycled. Tissue and paper towels, styrofoam, don't put styrofoam in there. Electronics, people do try to put electronics and batteries in there. Clothing and textiles. This is actually harmful to recycling because, again, the resources that have to be put into pulling these out are great, and it decreases the resources that we have that we can put into actually doing the recycling. So what you can recycle in Scottsdale, again, paper and corrugated cardboard, yes, you can recycle this, okay? Plastic beverage containers, yes, you can recycle these. No other, again, they're limited on plastic. So when you look at plastic containers, please be cautious to look at whether or not that container is the right number of plastic that could be recycled. And then also, the other thing that you want to look at is, did it contain a hazardous product? If it contained a hazardous product, it cannot be recycled. So again, when you look at plastics, all plastic cups, containers, tubs, jugs, and jars can be, but if it contained a hazardous product, then you cannot include that. Glass containers, metal cans, again, can be recycled. However, no styrofoam, no plastic bags. My husband, I yell at him every time he tries to put a plastic bag in there. I'm like, no. And plastic bags are actually harmful because, again, as you probably know, it binds up their equipment. And then lastly, when you recycle, please rinse out your food first. That's one of the ways that you can actually enhance natural capital, okay? So causes of environmental problems, many environmental problems today. So major underlying causes of most of our environmental problems today are unsustainable resource use, as you probably can guess, and unsustainable population growth. We're going to come back to these and spend more time on these later. And then the last two we're going to talk briefly about here. Negative externalities, which you may not know what that is yet, and economic inequality. So let's talk about those two. So again, we're going to come back to unsustainable resource use, but as you can guess, again, you can kind of figure that one out on how that impacts our environmental problems. And same with unsustainable population growth. The more larger the population of humans is, the larger amount of resources we're using. Okay, so negative externality. Negative externality occurs when the harms that are caused by creating goods and services are not included in the overall cost, right? And so this happens, again, quite often. So for example, the price of gas doesn't include the cost of harm to human health by air pollution, right? Or by the pollution that occurs to actually get that resource, right? So when we're actually harvesting that resource, we're doing harm to the environment as well, and harming our ecosystems and ecosystem services that can be provided by those ecosystems. So the real price of gas should be about $2 more per gallon than it is, to include the actual harm that is caused by, again, the use of that resource. So again, negative externalities are often a problem. So for example, again, overfishing or overuse of land resources and pollution are often not included in the overall cost of something. Now, when we talk about economic inequality, this is what we consider the gap between the rich and the poor. And you may say, well, why is economic inequality really an important thing for sustainability and looking at the natural capital? How could that be harmful to natural capital? And the reason is that poverty causes several harmful environmental and health effects. The daily lives of the world's poorest people are centered on just getting enough food and water and fuel for cooking and heating just to survive for themselves and their family. And these individuals are focused on survival. They can't worry about long-term environmental quality or stability. So collectively together, they may degrade forests. So they may, again, be clear-cutting land for farming in the Amazon to simply just provide for their family. So they're more likely to degrade forests, topsoil, grasslands, and deplete things like fisheries and wildlife populations simply just to stay alive. So economic inequality actually is very important. And as you can see, again, over time, this economic inequality, this gap, has become larger. And it's increasing not only just in the US, but again, around the world, worldwide. And so, again, inequality is related with things like loss of species. And I use this example of the vaquita because I just was down in Mexico. I just took students down for a study abroad experience down there. And the vaquita porpoise is highly endangered. I don't know how many of you know about the vaquita porpoise, but it's the most endangered species on our list right now. There are only about 10 vaquita that remain in the wild. And unfortunately, right now, fishing practices have really been the demise of the vaquita. And so there has been really a big push for, the right fishing practices. And it's mainly the fishing of the overfishing of the species called the tuatoba fish. But the challenge is that with these poor fishermen, again, that are just trying to get enough tuatoba to feed their families and to meet the basics of survival, are not really concerned about the vaquita, right? They're more concerned with their day-to-day survival, with just being able to provide for their family. And so they may use these gill nets that are very harmful for the vaquita species. Again, because they just simply can't consider the loss of this species. So again, inequality can oftentimes be correlated with loss of species, increased resource consumption, and increased waste. And the countries that have higher inequality have usually a larger environmental impact. So rich countries oftentimes tend to dump their environmental problems on poor countries. We actually send out our recycling. We used to send out a lot more of it to places like China. And then China had this issue with a lot of this recycling material that they couldn't recycle, and it ended up causing huge issues with waste over there. And so that's a very simple example of how some of these rich countries tend to dump environmental problems on other countries. And typically more money equals more political power and larger impacts on overall policies as well. So this is how, again, inequality can typically impact the environment. Now, when we look at something like affluence, the wealth of the country, this is usually measured by something that we call the GDP, or gross domestic product. And our gross domestic product is simply the value of all the goods and services that are produced in a year. And oftentimes we report this in a way that's easier for us to understand. We report this per capita. So we will take the total and then divide it up by the number of people or the population size for that area and report it per capita or per individual. So in Qatar, the gross domestic product is 132,000, again, per capita. Now, again, as you can probably guess, not everybody out there, even though that's the per capita, is making $132,000 a year based on, again, selling these goods and services. Again, you have a number of individuals that are really rich and a number of individuals that are very poor. And again, this is the average, right? The US is at 50, their gross domestic product is about 53,000 per capita. Mexico is 10,000. India is just at 1,498 per capita, and Somalia is at 400. Now, obviously, again, the population size plays a big fact in your GDP per capita, okay, calculations. Okay, so that's gross domestic product. Now, I want to talk about is gross domestic product really a great way to measure economic growth? So is increased economic activity always good? And remember that GDP, gross domestic product, here only measures economic factors. So there's another indicator for economic growth called GPI, and that's genuine progress indicator. And this actually includes human well-being and the environment. So it's going to include other factors. So we talked about, again, when we look at GDP per capita, you know, when we look at the US, $50,000, you know, every family is not living off of that, okay? So is that GDP fairly distributed? Or, again, is most of the wealth with a small group of people and then a larger group of people, again, are in the poorer category? So again, is that GDP fairly distributed? And so then we can also look at, are people happy and healthy? So genuine progress indicator is going to include human well-being and the environment. So are people happy? Are they healthy? And is the environment being sustained? So here you can see, again, this is a genuine progress for the United States, and this was from the 1950s. And then you can see here is the US per capita, okay, in the thousands here. And so you can see here's the gross domestic product that has continually increased since the 1950s. However, you can see that while the world GDP, the world and the US GDP has soared since the 1950s, the genuine progress indicator has not. It's flatlined. And So I like the GPI as an indicator of economic growth because it includes these other very important factors. Obviously, if people are happy and healthy, that's a very important factor to include. And is the environment sustained? Now, let's talk a little bit about a kind of recent example of how this healthy should be considered in some of our again, practices today. So, for example, again, in the US, obviously, factory farming is one of our dominant farming industries. And if you look here, farming factories or factory farms oftentimes, again, have a small area of land with many animals crammed in there. And this increases the potential for disease. Now, a factory farm may make more money per plot of land, right, per acre, because again, you have a lot of animals per acre. However, so if you looked at just GDP, that looks like a great example of economic growth. However, if you consider again things like the health of that industry and the impact on human health, then there's a much different outlook on that. And so this is great because this is something that's happening now. As of June 13th, 2024, the CDC is watching closely the H5N1 bird flu, as you probably have heard. And if you look here, as of, again, June 17th, we've had 96 million poultry affected by the bird flu. And this is primarily, again, chickens. So we can see that 101 dairy herds have been affected, and the states with outbreaks in poultry are 48. So again, when we look at the overall health, here's where, again, we may consider factory farms as a, economic growth financially, right? Economically. But then when we look at the overall health and its impact on humans, here's where we need to take into account whether or not this practice is sustainable and healthy. And so right now, the states with reported human cases are 3, but the CDC is closely following this because, again, obviously these poultry farmers and these dairy farmers, because now we have cows that are actually being impacted by the bird flu, are at a high risk for infection with this H5N1 bird flu. And if, again, there are enough of these poultry workers and these dairy workers that are infected with the H5N1 bird flu, they can potentially spread it to family members who can potentially spread it, again, to community members. And this is how, again, things like epidemics and pandemics occur. So if you want more information, you can actually follow the CDC bird flu here at this link. And so when we compare developed countries to developing countries, we can see, and developed countries are going to include, again, countries like US, Japan, Canada, Australia, Germany, and most of the European countries. And what we see is that just 17% of the world's population lies within developed countries. However, these developed countries have 85% of the wealth and have 88% of the resource consumption. So again, a small percentage of the world's population is using the majority of the Earth's natural resources and also then producing the majority of the waste. So again, the 17% of the population is producing 75% of the waste and pollution. And so again, you can see the distribution here of how developed countries and developing countries play different roles in sustainability here. So again, this is important, sorry to go back to this slide, because again, there are countries like the US with only 4.4% of the world's population that use about 30% of the world's resources. In many parts of the world, renewable forests are shrinking, deserts are expanding, and topsoil is eroding. And this leads to the degradation of life-supporting systems that are upholding all of humanity. So again, just 17% of the population is impacting, the population all over the world with this resource consumption and waste pollution. So again, the distribution isn't equal. Let's also talk about something called trade-offs. When we consider sustainability, we have to consider trade-offs. Trade-offs are things that happen when something is lost or decreased in return for an increase in something else. So, for example, when we look at wind power, okay, wind power has trade-offs, okay? So even though if we're using wind power, this decreases air pollution in comparison to, cheap coal-powered plants, we also end up impacting bird populations in a negative way. So obviously wind turbine power actually kills birds. It kills many birds, and it actually threatens certain migratory songbirds and bats. So again, there's that trade-off, right? Wind power versus birds. But however, the alternative is to use things like cheap coal for power production. And that produces a lot of air pollution, and that air pollution causes climate change. So which one of these has a larger overall impact on the bird population, right? And so that's what we have to consider when we consider these things like trade-offs. Does using cheap coal produce enough air pollution to spur on things like climate change? And is climate change impacting more birds than, again, the birds that are being killed by wind turbines? Those are the trade-offs and questions that we have to ask ourselves in environmental science. One of the things that we can use to calculate human impacts when we're talking about environmental science is something called IPAT. And IPAT is where human impact can be calculated using this IPAT equation. So IPAT was another environmental impact model developed in the early 1970s by scientists Paul Ehrlich and John Holdren. And this model actually shows us that the environmental impact, which is I of human activities, is the product of three major factors. One, P. The P is for population size. Okay. The A is for affluence, or the way that we measure this is resource consumption per person. So affluence means how many resources can we consume per person. Obviously, a more affluent area is going to consume more resources per person. And then times T for technology. And again, the T for technology, that T factor can actually be harmful or beneficial. Technologies can be harmful or beneficial. Technologies such as polluting factories, gas-guzzling vehicles, or coal-burning power plants, right, are going to increase our harmful environmental impact, while other technologies, like those involved with preventing pollution, pollution control, fuel-efficient cars, wind turbines, solar energy that can generate electricity with a lower harmful impact, those are going to be technologies with a positive impact. So again, those impacts can be negative or positive. Again, and one of the ways that we can measure this is using something that we call, when we look at affluence, which is the level of wealth or consumption of resources, we can look at this consumption of resources, literally the number of resources that each individual is using in a country, by measuring something called the ecological footprint. So when we are measuring affluence, and I could have been more clear on this in the slide. So when we are measuring affluence, this should be kind of jutted in here, is measured using something called the ecological footprint, okay? So to measure our ecological footprint, and what an ecological footprint is it's the amount of land and water needed to provide resources and recycle waste for a person or group of people. And honestly, usually we measure an ecological footprint by hectares per individual. So again, it's usually measured in hectares, okay? And for those of you that don't know what a hectare is an area that's 100 meters by 100 meters. So it will actually equal about 10,000 square meters, or exactly 10,000 square meters. And this is about the size of a baseball field. Okay? So we'll usually measure that again in hectares. And there are three main sources that we consider. We consider agriculture, right? So we need to consider the land and water that is needed to provide the agricultural needs per individual. Also transportation. So again, the amount of land and water that's needed to provide resources for transportation, and then for heating and cooling of buildings. Okay, those are kind of the three main sources. And so, just per chance, which country do you think has the largest ecological footprint per person? Is it China, India, US, or Japan? Which one of those do you think would have the largest, again, per capita, per person, largest footprint per capita, the largest land use per, again, individual? So if you picked number 3, US, you're correct. So when we look at countries that have the highest total ecological footprints per capita, countries like the US, Canada, and United Arab Emirates all have kind of the highest per capita ecological footprints. These are going to be countries that have footprints that are closer to 8.1 global hectares per person. So when we look at total ecological footprints versus per capita, and so remember, this question is per person, you might think, well, the total ecological footprint for China has got to be way more than the US, right? And yes, it is. The total ecological footprint is because there are simply way more people in China, right? However, when you look at that per capita, that ecological footprint per person, it's much higher in the US. So again, our per capita footprint is higher because of affluence here. And so again, we can't just look at the total ecological footprint per country, but we also need to break it down and look at the ecological footprint per capita. So again, that is a big difference that we see here. And that is important, again, because again, we have right now, about 1.6 Earths are needed to sustain the global rate of renewable resources per person, per person use indefinitely. So right now, to be sustainable with all of the people that we have on this planet, we really need 1.6 Earths. However, the number of Earths that would be needed to sustain the world's population at the average per person US resource consumption rate would actually be 5. So again, our resource use, this is where we look at, when we look at resource use, again, is not distributed equally, okay? So if you have any questions on this, please let me know. These are just things to consider when we consider environmental science, important factors. And I do have a couple videos for you to watch this week. So please make sure that you see each week I post some extra videos that have some important content for that week. And those videos usually supplement things in my lecture that do it in a more entertaining way, because I know that you can only listen to me drone on for so long. So please watch those videos, and please, again, pay attention for my announcements each week. I try to share those announcements with you so that I can make sure that you are up to date and current with what needs to be done that week. All right, I will see you back for lecture 3.